Here is a question for you. What do you get when you take a brand new car company that is already in financial trouble, give its engineers barely 2 years to design a family saloon from scratch, tell them to raid the parts bin of every other car in the factory, and then launch it against the most dominant vehicle in the British market? You get the Morris Marina. And here is the thing, it actually worked. For a while. Cast your mind back to April of 1971. Britain was still finding its feet after the turbulence of the late 1960s. The postal workers had just ended a 7-week strike. Decimal currency had arrived only 2 months earlier, and millions of people were still doing mental arithmetic every time they bought a pint of milk. Edward Heath was in Downing Street, and the country was bracing itself for what would become one of the most difficult economic decades in living memory. Into this world, on the 27th of April 1971, drove the Morris Marina. The British Leyland Motor Corporation, that great, sprawling, ungainly conglomerate formed when Leyland Motors merged with British Motor Holdings in 1968, needed a winner, desperately. Its most modern products were technically adventurous, yes, but fleet buyers simply did not trust them. The Austin Maxi, the Morris 1100. Brilliant engineering, perhaps, but not what a company car manager wanted to sign off on a bulk order. What fleet buyers wanted was something straightforward, something that looked sensible, drove predictably, and did not leave a mechanic scratching his head. What they wanted, in short, was something like the Ford Cortina. And that is precisely what British Leyland set out to build. Over the 9 years that followed, more than 1,200,000 Morris Marinas rolled out of the Cowley plant in Oxford, a car that became Britain's second best-selling vehicle in 1973, inspired the very first Hyundai, and eventually became one of the most beloved punchlines in British television history. This is the story of the Morris Marina, and it is far more interesting than Jeremy Clarkson would have you believe. Fact 1. The problem British Leyland needed to solve. When the bosses at the newly formed British Leyland sat down in 1968 and took stock of what they actually had, the news was not encouraging. On the Austin side of the house, there was genuine engineering innovation, front-wheel drive, transverse engines, all the hallmarks of Alicus Agonis. But on the Morris side, the flagship volume product was the Morris Minor, a car that had first rolled off the line back in 1948, 20 years old, and still in production. Alongside it sat the 1100 and 1300 range, a decade old, and looking it. Meanwhile, Ford was selling Cortinas by the 100,000 every single year. Fleet managers loved the Cortina because it was simple, conventional, and easy to maintain. Rear-wheel drive. Live rear axle. Straightforward. And in 1969, the fleet market accounted for roughly 2/5 of all new car sales in Britain. British Leyland's management, led by Donald Stokes, understood the problem clearly. They needed a conventional rear-wheel drive family saloon, and they needed it fast. The project was given the internal code name ADO 28, and the brief was simple. Build Britain's answer to the Cortina, get it into showrooms by 1971, and keep the development costs as low as humanly possible. The man given responsibility for styling was Roy Haynes, and here is where the story gets interesting. Because Roy Haynes was the very same designer who had styled the Ford Cortina Mark II, launched in 1966. He had left Ford and joined what would become British Leyland, and now he was being asked to beat the car he had already designed once. Haynes produced both a saloon and a coupe proposal, presented to British Leyland's Executive Committee on the 5th of August, 1968. Alongside competing designs from the Italian houses Pininfarina and Michelotti. Remarkably, Haynes won against both of them. His original vision was ambitious. He proposed a shared floor pan between different models, a concept that would not become common industry practice for another decade. He wanted the coupe to be a genuinely sporty machine in the mold of the Ford Capri, distinct, attractive, aimed at younger buyers. But budget cuts intervened at every turn. The coupe ended up sharing the same front doors as the saloon. The sophisticated McPherson strut front suspension was abandoned in favor of the lever-arm damper setup carried over from the Morris Marina. Even the plan for a new 4-speed gearbox was dropped. Haynes himself left the company in February 1969, less than 16 months after arriving. Harris Mann, later responsible for the Austin Allegro and the Princess, took over as chief stylist. The car that Haynes had envisioned had already been substantially compromised by the time the first production Marinas rolled off the line at Cowley. What the public eventually bought was a car built almost entirely from existing parts. The front suspension came from the Morris Marina. The gearbox was borrowed from the Triumph 1300 and 1500 range. The smaller engine was the familiar 1275 cubic centimeter A-series unit from the Austin Morris 1300, producing 60 brake horsepower at 5,250 revolutions per minute. The larger engine, fitted to the 1.8 models, was the 1,798 cubic centimeter B-series unit, the very same engine that powered the MGB sports car. Development costs overran badly, driven by the repeated design changes and the need to rebuild the aging Cowley plant. In a bitter corporate irony, this straightforward, parts-bin family saloon ended up costing more to develop than the technically sophisticated Austin Allegro. Fact 2. Launch day and an immediate crisis. The Marina was shown to the press at a pre-launch event in Cannes, in the south of France, in early 1971. Motoring journalists Jeff Daniels and Doug Nye were handed a 1.8 TC variant to try. What happened next was, to put it diplomatically, alarming. The car's understeer, the tendency for the front of the car to push wide rather than follow the driver's intended line, was not merely notable. It was, as Autocar magazine later described it, almost heroic. On a tight bend, at speed, the car ended up on the wrong side of the road. Daniels contacted Chief Engineer Harry Webster directly, and Webster acted quickly. A last-minute modification to the front suspension geometry was made on the 1.8-liter cars before the formal public launch. But the damage was not entirely contained. Approximately 30,000 Marinas were sold to the public with the original, incorrect suspension setup, requiring dealer correction after the fact. Despite all of this, the official public launch on Tuesday, the 27th of April 1971, went down remarkably well. At the Morris garages on St. Aldate Street in Oxford, the dealership filled its showroom with a shallow pool, placing the new Marinas on raised platforms above the water, playing, of course, on the nautical theme of the name. Customers were enthusiastic. Orders came in quickly. British Leyland reported it was producing 2,000 cars per week and spoke ambitiously about reaching 5,000 per week by the end of the year. 11 months after launch, on the 29th of March, 1972, the 100,000th Marina, a 1.8 TC saloon, came off the Cowley line. By February 1973, British Leyland announced that 250,000 had been built in less than 2 years. In 1973, the Marina reached its commercial peak. That year, it secured second place in the UK car sales charts with 115,000 registrations, behind only the Ford Cortina, which sold 181,616 units. The Marina accounted for approximately 6.9% of the total British market. For a car that had been designed as a stopgap, built in a hurry, and compromised at every stage of development, this was a remarkable achievement. The launch price of the entry-level 1.3 standard saloon in 1971 was approximately £900. For context, the Ford Cortina 1000, 300 litres of the same year, was priced at around £922. British Leyland had, against considerable odds, landed the Marina in almost exactly the right place. Fact 3. Life on the road, strengths, weaknesses, and industrial chaos. If you bought a Morris Marina in 1971 and used it the way most people used family cars driving to work, ferrying the children, taking the occasional motorway run, you would probably have been perfectly content. The 1.8 TC, with twin carburetors and 85 brake horsepower, was genuinely brisk for its class. In coupe form, it was quicker than the MGB from which it borrowed its engine, a fact that British Leyland's marketing team rather understandably chose not to advertise too widely. The interior was practical. There was a reasonable amount of room inside for a family of 4. The controls, including the stalk-mounted switches for the wipers and washers borrowed from Triumph, were considered quite modern at the time. The boot was usable. Running costs were low. Parts were plentiful, because so many of them were shared with other BL vehicles. For a working-class family in Coventry or Cardiff or Glasgow, the Marina offered solid, dependable, affordable transport, and that was what millions of people actually needed. But reliability, both mechanical and reputational, was undercut by 2 forces that the designers could do nothing about. The first was the lever arm dampers inherited from the Morris Marina. By 1971, this type of suspension technology was already 20 years old. Motorway speeds, improved road surfaces, and the expectations of buyers who had experienced sharper, more modern rivals made the Marina's handling feel noticeably behind the times. The suspension was eventually updated, but not before the car had acquired a reputation for softness and imprecision that proved impossible to fully shake. The second problem was Cowley itself. The plant had recorded 347 separate industrial disputes in the 10 months from January to October 1970. The measured day work system designed to reduce the piecework disputes that were plaguing production was only accepted by the workforce on the 18th of January, 1971, after BL management threatened to move Marina production to another factory entirely. Even then, disputes continued to erupt regularly throughout the decade, disrupting output at precisely the moments when BL most needed a consistent, reliable supply of cars. By 1974, the oil crisis had hit. The 3-day working week, imposed in January of that year, throttled production across the entire British motor industry. British Leyland's situation was becoming critical. In 1975, the company was bailed out by the government under the Ryder Report, and Sir Michael Edwards was brought in to try to rescue the business. It was against this backdrop of perpetual financial and industrial crisis that the Marina had to compete against a Ford Cortina that Ford was actively and consistently developing. And yet the car kept selling. Taken across the whole of the 1970s, the Morris Marina was the 4th best-selling car in Britain overall, and British Leyland's 2nd bestseller behind the Mini. That is not the record of a complete failure. Fact 4. The unexpected legacy Hyundai and the Marina's global reach. Here is a fact that almost nobody who drove a Marina ever knew. In 1974, British Leyland's former managing director George Turnbull was hired by the South Korean Hyundai conglomerate. Turnbull had been the man most directly responsible for getting the Marina into production, and when he traveled to Korea to help Hyundai build its first indigenous car, he took 2 Morris Marinas with him. 1 saloon, 1 coupe. He also brought a team of British engineers who had worked on the Marina project. The result, built on a reworked Marina platform, fitted with Mitsubishi engines, and restyled from the coupe body by Giorgetto Giugiaro of Ital Design, was the Hyundai Pony. Launched in 1975, the Pony was the first mass-produced Korean automobile, and its global success transformed Hyundai from a domestic construction company into one of the world's major car manufacturers. In other words, the DNA of the Morris Marina runs directly through the birth of the modern Korean automotive industry. Not many British family saloons from the 1970s can claim that kind of legacy. Back in Britain, the Marina was also exported to North America as the Austin Marina, the Morris name meaning almost nothing to American buyers, while the Austin Healey heritage at least offered some recognition. From 1973 to 1975, it was sold in the United States. Emissions requirements strangled its 1.8-liter engine badly, and the US government accused British Leyland of dumping cars below cost. American sales were poor, and exports there ended after 1975. Canadian sales continued until 1978. In Australia, over 30,000 Marinas were produced at the Zetland factory in New South Wales, with higher specification interiors and uprated running gear that many regarded as superior to the British product. South Africa and Malaysia also assembled marinas locally throughout the 1970s. On the competition circuit, and this often surprises people, the Marina was not without honor. BL's special tuning department prepared a 1.3 coupe for the 1971 RAC Rally, driven by Brian Kulcheth and Willie Cave. Their car, producing 105 brake horsepower against the standard 60, won its class outright and finished 20th overall in a highly competitive field. Fact 5. The slow decline and the ITIL. By the mid-1970s, the Marina's age was becoming increasingly obvious. The Ford Cortina had been substantially updated in 1973, and again in 1976. The Vauxhall Cavalier arrived in 1975. The Volkswagen Golf, introduced in 1974, was pointing towards a fundamentally different kind of family car. The Marina, with its 1971 suspension and its 1971 body, was falling further behind every year. In 1978, the 1.7-liter O-Series overhead camshaft engine was introduced into the range, replacing the long-running B-Series unit. It was a more modern engine, but most road testers found it offered no great improvement in real-world performance. The following year, British Leyland approached Giorgetto Giugiaro's ITIL Design studio for help in freshening the car's appearance. What ITIL Design actually did was limited new front-end styling, revised tail lamp clusters. The fundamental structure remained the 1971 original. The resulting car, launched in 1980 as the Morris ITIL, wore the name of the Italian designers who had contributed relatively little to it and fooled nobody. Motoring journalists recognized immediately that they were looking at a 9-year-old body with a new coat of paint. The ITIL itself lasted until 1984, when the Morris name was finally retired from British passenger cars after more than 70 years. The Austin Montego replaced it in the medium family car segment, and that was that. Total production of the Marina between 1971 and 1980 reached approximately 1,163,000 units. Around 703,000 of those were sold in the United Kingdom. Fact 6. The piano, and what it really means. And so we arrive at what most people under the age of 40 know the Morris Marina for. In the summer of 2008, Top Gear's production team set fire to a Morris Marina on camera, under the premise of having converted it into a garden brazier. The Morris Marina Owners Club, a serious and dedicated organization of enthusiasts, founded in 1985, was understandably furious. Their response on internet forums was passionate and heartfelt. Top Gear's response, as the program's script editor Richard Porter later admitted in his book, was utterly childish. Another Marina was sourced. A grand piano was dropped on it from a crane. This happened not once but multiple times across subsequent series. In Series 12, Episode 7. In Series 13, Episode 5, where the Marina was declared with tongue placed firmly in cheek, the best rear-wheel drive car that money can buy. In Series 14, Episode 3, where a Marina arrived on screen with a piano already strapped to its roof, only to have a second piano dropped on it anyway. The joke was never really about the Marina's engineering. It was pantomime. It was Clarkson and the Top Gear team finding that the Owners Club's indignant responses were funnier than almost anything the production team could invent. The more furious the letters and the forum posts, the more irresistible the gag became. But here is the thing that the Top Gear treatment obscured. By the time the pianos were falling, the Morris Marina was already desperately rare. In 2006, only 745 were registered on UK roads. By December 2019, that number had recovered somewhat to 374 taxed examples and a further 498 on statutory off-road notices. These are not the numbers of a car that deserved casual destruction. The Marina Owners Club continues to operate to this day, and the cars that remain are, almost without exception, cherished and well-maintained examples of a vehicle that its original buyers found perfectly satisfactory, which, when you think about it, was all it was ever supposed to be. So what do we make of the Morris Marina? It was not a great car. It was not even a particularly good car by the standards of what was technically possible in 1971. Its suspension was already dated on the day it launched. Its development was rushed, compromised, and plagued by cost-cutting. Its build quality was inconsistent, its rust resistance was poor, and it was kept in production for nearly twice as long as its designers had ever intended. Because British Leyland simply did not have anything better to put in its place. But it sold. It sold in enormous numbers, for an entire decade, to ordinary working families across Britain who needed reliable, affordable, practical transport. It sold to fleet managers who valued its simplicity and its low running costs. It sold in Australia, in South Africa, in New Zealand, in Canada, and briefly in the United States. It inspired the car that launched an entire national automotive industry in South Korea. And the men and women who drove Marinas off the forecourts of Morris dealers across Britain in the 1970s were not fools. They were making sensible, rational choices for their families and their circumstances, and for the most part, the car served them well. The piano jokes were funny. Even the owners' club would probably admit, at a safe distance, that some of the gags landed. But there is a real car underneath the punchline. A car with a genuine story, a complicated birth, a remarkable sales record, and a legacy that stretches further than most people would ever guess. Now I would love to hear from you. Did you own a Marina? Did your family have one? Was it as bad as Top Gear would have you believe? Or was it quietly getting on with the job while everyone ignored it? Leave your memories in the comments below. These are the kinds of stories that the production figures alone can never tell. If you found this video worthwhile, please do consider subscribing and clicking the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who share the same passion for the cars that actually shaped Britain's roads. And as always, thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories. And thank you for keeping this history alive.